So just picking up where we ended with the initial conversation, I just want to reiterate the kind of concept, the thesis of what this morning was about. And so here what we have is Edmund Bacon, who is kind of like the father of urban renewal, as we were talking about downstairs during lunch. And this kind of top-down understanding of how we dealt with cities, how we deal with history, kind of ended up producing, and this is colonial Williamsburg, produced this kind of purist idea of what history is. And it, in a way, it eradicates very much the kind of nuances that you're trying to get from your modeling. And then I'm going to shift over to today, just to kind of make it clear. So here's our cover of Time. With a Snowden on it and multiple faces, so it's a kind of anti-hero. And here we have a hero, and what I'm showing you here is Bacon's art studio, which was archaeologically studied, deconstructed, and then put back together in a museum. So what you're looking at is a new form of a period room. So just think of all of the information that is in this room that in a traditional preservation mentality you would have lost. So if there's one thing out of today, this slide is the thing that you should keep in your mind, that this shift is occurring. Remember there's 5 kind of critiques I talked about. Well, each one of those things ends up in a new way that historic sites or public venues want to deal with whatever their function or interpretation is. And so this was the community one, and I'm showing you all of these various different ways that historic sites are actually going out and engaging the community, whether it's a naturalization ceremony or yoga in one of the period rooms, or turning their kind of colonial revival-esque gardens into community gardens. I already talked about the mobile kiosk, and then also the idea of going out to places that have nothing to do with your site, and that you actually find out what people are interested in rather than expecting them to be interested in what you're doing. The next thing is, remember we talked about communication, that people don't consider historic sites to be really good at talking to others. And these are all different ways of trying to communicate at a new level of relevancy. All the way from the tiny little signs. Remember some of those videos that I showed you of videotaping experiences in historic sites, all the do not touch signs? Well, the notion of kind of turning that on its ear, pretending that you are in on the joke. And instead of telling people to stay away, you actually engage them and tell them to play the piano. This is the Heidelberg Project in Detroit, where you actually could write your name on the house in water-soluble ink and give them money for restoration to restore the house. And then also this is opening up all of the rooms, opening up what you do, what used to be private and curated, and you really tie it into a kind of tactile immersion of a visitor experience. This one is showing you a kind of series of contemporary art exhibits in historic sites, all the way from site-specific dance to site-specific visual. In this case, it's a video installation throughout the entire house. This is a video showing you of a site-specific theater piece where it went throughout the entire house, and you just followed it around like Sleep No More. This is a site-specific contemporary art piece it's called Shantytown in Philadelphia, and it's in this beautiful colonial revival garden, and it was talking about poverty and wealth during the colonial times, but it also overlapped it with present-day Philadelphia. And then here's an example. This is at the Schindler House in LA, where you actually are just allowed to lie on the furniture. Instead of getting a tour, you actually can lie down by the fireplace and read the book. And you can just kind of spend your own time and degree of time. And then the environment itself. That the total kind of quality of what you experience is sensory. It's not just kind of text, it's not just a tour guide. This sound that you're hearing is a sound mapping project for a historic site that mapped sounds that you would normally hear in that site. This is a Greenbelt Museum outside of Washington, D.C., where everything, including the closets, are full of debris and things that all of us have naturally. This is at the Gage Foundation in Syracuse, New York. You actually walk in and they serve you tea and you watch an introductory video. That's your experience at the house, and it's served on a women's right to vote tea set. So it just kind of like produces that relationship of what the narrative is about. I wanted to show you this because this is the Automobile Driving Museum in El Segundo, California. I went out there to visit this. This is the museum last year. This is the museum now. What they did is they took the ropes, and in this case, chains, down. And also I want you to note, let me see if this will work. You actually get to ride in the cars. So they've gone from behind chains to, you go every Saturday and they have 5 different cars you can get into and they ride you around the neighborhood. They said that their attendance has just skyrocketed. The reason why I show you this is because it really is just a kind of philosophic shift. It's a kind of understanding that there are multiple levels of narrative and multiple ways that you can interpret the same object. This is a car, this is a car. You can just experience them in different ways. And a little bit earlier, here, let me show you this.
House Trust, the prize, getting to lend a hand in the restoration of the Bronx cottage Poe lived in from 1846 to 1849. So exciting. I hardly slept last night. I mean, Miller and other winners were able to help plaster the walls of the cottage located on the Grand Concourse and Kingsbridge Road. Their winning submissions were put inside a time capsule placed within the wall.
So this was an international contest. People flew in to do this plastering of the Poe cottage in New York City. Now, if you think this is crazy, that people are actually going to come and spend days plastering a historic house, look at this one. Come on. You can do it.
Up in the morning, out on the job.
I started this as a joke.
Like the devil from my bed.
I've got a lesbian and gay meetup group called Historic House Museum Nerds Unite. And I said, let's just go around and start cleaning the windows at these historic sites. I thought I'd get 1 or 2 people. We now go around to these sites, spend the morning just cleaning the windows. I also have this idea of going into historic sites and dusting. Instead of a tour, give them a feather duster. This is what people want. This is the kind of engagement with history. Like you said, you brought the artifacts with you because people want to touch them. People want to wash windows. And then I put this in here and I'm so happy to see this. This was a student project. Remember I said that history and preservation is going from the granular? Well, this was a preservation student's assessment of the history of a historic site within understanding and looking at the lock itself. So what you're seeing is the lock moving, and then the history of the site, the narrative, is overlaid behind it. So it's this really kind of poetic idea. I thought you guys would like the window washing one. This one's kind of interesting. This is a beautiful, beautifully restored house, the Powell House in Philadelphia. This is a contemporary artist putting this video together. This is all not computer design, but it's aided. This is a beautiful dining room. So what he's doing is he's actually showing what Powell House will look like in 100 years. And so this thing, of course, is just this shocking thing to preservationists, but it didn't mess up the house at all. But this is one of the kind of contemporary art pieces that are really engaging young people right now, which is that kind of using the house as a datum for thinking, thoughts about preservation. And And then I mentioned Vagnone earlier. I just wanted to show you this, so I threw it on the end. This is the house right now, and if you can ever get there, it's in Warsaw, Virginia. This is the stair that you walk through. It's really incredible. It's fabulous. This is what they're planning on doing to it. So it's this kind of glass container that dovetails with the ruins. So it's a stabilized ruin with a new construction, and their function is going to be a kind of community space. So it's a really kind of interesting idea of overlapping interpretation and narrative with a new function.
So we've had three very unique approaches to considering, I guess, interpretation. Maybe we'll just start with, I don't know if this is obvious or not, but I think I would be interested to know from each of your perspectives what the goal of interpretation should be, because we've got someone who deals with the challenges of dealing with incomplete artifacts that are layered in a single space, and then John focuses on taking a potentially infinite number of objects and making them available outside of space and time. And then we have thinking about new approaches to heritage. How do you rectify a decentralized understanding of heritage where validity rests in an individual and their understanding, their sensory appreciation of a site? So maybe we'll get the same answer, but I was just curious, what is the purpose of interpretation, broadly or specifically?
To tell a story.
To tell a story.
To tell a story. To tell a story interestingly, accurately, in your case, with as much depth and information as possible, and making it fun. I don't know.
Yeah, making it fun. That there are so many ways to encounter, whether it be the space or and that it's all interpretation by us. And so to see this sort of more unusual approaches by community members to a space when they're coming in doing these art projects or the wonderful window washing. I mean, similarly, you can put a call out and you can get all sorts of people who are willing to sit for hours and with a toothbrush wash tiny bits of broken stone tools. And
one of my guys said he was going to bring Q-tips next time. You would have loved him, right?
Exactly. So similarly, and that's a totally different way to experience the history of being at Willowbank, is to sit and wash broken pottery and stone tool materials. And all the different stories that can come out. Like, I love the Lincoln's left here, I don't mean to brag. One thing that really struck me is so much of the archaeological material seems to, the European stuff, corroborate what some of the letters say, which was how dire Hannah's existence after Alexander perished was here. And you wouldn't get that sense if you were to look at the home now. We would want to see it pristine, and if we were to restore to that Hamilton era, we would see it as this wealthy family. And that couldn't, it seems, be further than the truth. One of the sort of things, the friend of mine who did the faunal analysis of the collection that came out of the bright urban component of the site indicated that so much of the butchering indicated that it was the cheaper cuts that were here. So presumably they were buying, they didn't have the money to buy the more expensive cuts out of the, when they purchased meat, which seems rather trivial, but it further confirms this idea that they were pretty poorly off. And yeah, and it's an entirely different sort of interpretive kind of headspace, I think, than what I think of when I go to a historic house museum where it generally looks like everybody's in their Sunday best. The house is in its Sunday best, and that wasn't life lived here.
in most places it wasn't. And when we speak interpretively, that's generally the truth. I mean, that video about Monticello earlier. I mean, there are letters about you going to Monticello for dinner and water dripping on the dining room table because the roof is leaking and the chair has, you know, horsehair coming out of the seat and stuff like that. He's running around in his bare feet with his teacup, kind of oblivious to it all. I mean, that's a kind of interesting environment, you know, that you'd want to be a part of just to experience it, but that's not what it's about, and I get that.
Yeah.
You know?
I would say three things. I mean, one's a flippant answer, that is, you know, the purpose of interpretation is whatever the interpreter wants. But, I mean, a little less flippant is you know, I think a lot about this question from the standpoint of pedagogy. And one of the things I try to say to my students is look, there's no you know, when you're looking at something and trying to explain it or understand it or whatever, there's never going to be a self-evident answer about what that thing means. You know, interpretation, and the purpose of interpretation, as I understand it, is you're relating it to some kind of context. And, you know, hopefully you do a good job, hopefully it's a defensible idea, but in some, you know, you're basically connecting this thing with something else, and that's what you're trying to do when you're interpreting the past. Now, you know, in terms of when I'm talking to my students, one of the things I like to say is that I'm part of the George Gershwin School of History. And by that, what I mean is I'm trying to teach my students when they, first of all, that there is it's important that they recognize that any piece of history that they're looking at is an interpretation. And the way that I try to get them to understand that, as opposed to just, I mean, they often come into me with a very naive understanding about what history is about. Basically, they've come through a school system where they are rewarded for repeating everything that they're given back. And that's the game. And so when they come to somebody like me, I'm saying the game has changed. And, you know, there's some resistance to that. I mean, and it's, you know, students aren't any different than us. You know, think about how you feel in a workplace when your employer comes and says you have to work differently than you did in the past. Do you like that? I don't. I don't even like it when the format for Microsoft Word changes. It puts me in a bad mood for a week. You know, the same thing is extended with our students, that, you know, they don't like it that I have changed the rules of the game in terms of how they succeed in the history class. And I have to persuade them that that is the case. And so, you know, I basically have to get them to a point where they have to accept the ethic of George Gershwin. And what I'm talking about here is, are you all familiar with the opera Porgy and Bess? If you've never heard it, please do hear it, because it's like one of the most glorious pieces of music I think I've ever heard. Porgy and Bess is about a group of African Americans who live in Catfish Row in Charleston, South Carolina, in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it's about two people, Porgy and Bess, and there's some other characters who are involved with it, including a ne'er-do-well named Sportin'-Life, who's the local drug pusher. And, you know, as is the case with most operas, it all ends very badly. The two people who are in love are torn apart, and Sportin'-Life has his way, and it's all very terrible. But there's one scene in the opera where Sportin'-Life is talking to his party, and they're talking about the Bible, and he ends up singing one of the most famous songs of the opera, "It Ain't Necessarily So." So it ain't necessarily so, it ain't necessarily so, the things that you're liable to read in the Bible, well, they ain't necessarily so. You can imagine how scandalous that was to say back in the 1920s. But in any case, you know, when it comes to my classroom, I have no particular stake in how my students construct their theology, but I do when it comes to how they construct their history. And when I get to that point, I want my students to listen to Sportin'-Life. I want them to have a very critical orientation about the historical representations that they're presented. I want to get them to a point where they recognize they've got to look under the hood, so to speak, of whatever model that they're looking at, and you know, look at the evidence, look at the reasoning, and come to some conclusion about whether that interpretation commands their respect or not. And so, you know, I guess my bullet point answer to your question is why do we interpret, or why should we interpret? For me, one of the reasons is I want my students to become good critical thinkers. I didn't deserve that. Thank you.
I think a lot of heritage at its very root is about discourse. You have an object that the discourse is deemed worthy of doing something special with. You have a discourse around how to treat it. You undertake a treatment, and then the treated object spawns discourses of their own. I was working in New York City for New York City Parks 2 summers ago, and we did a lot of statue restoration. A particular statue had been spray painted and defaced. It was a heavily African American area, and I forget who it's not a big figure to Canadian history, Stuyvesant perhaps, a Dutch Stuyvesant, very prominent, important figure, good or bad, in New York's history, owned a lot of slaves, or was involved with the slave trade. Maybe I should.
He's just overall bad.
Just overall bad.
One of those hero bad people, you know? We don't know why.
And so our job was to go and clean spray paint or whatever defacing had happened. And I certainly had a lot of sympathy for what was perhaps an insensitive figure in an area that was very prominently set. But I was also torn between, if this figure was removed, this was a very important public discourse that had happened. And I guess we were talking about conflict before, and the importance of conflict in defining a space. It's not about, in many ways, it's not about changing the plaque in front of the building. It's not about including more people in the plaque. The point is the plaque can only say one thing. So how can interpretation include this discourse? It's not about changing a voice, but making it about a discourse of many voices.
Well, of course, you know the picture of the Black Lives Matter spray painted on the Confederate statue. I think that's in New Orleans or Richmond. I don't know which one it is. That's exactly the conversation that's happening, whether to remove them, whether to rename the streets, whether to add plaques to the houses. I would suspect that Stuyvesant statue was placed a long time ago when that area was not predominantly African American. I mean, you know, within 15, 20 years, populations shift dramatically in New York City. We saw that in Flushing. It used to be almost entirely African American, and now it's 85% Mandarin-speaking Chinese. So when you start to consider that which is very interesting because it's exactly what you're trying to grab hold of in your modeling. You know, in 1923 what it was, and 2014 what is it right now. So the building may not have changed, the statue may not have changed, but the perception of that statue has changed. Bringing it back to this room, you know, it's probably more difficult to talk about that with this room because we don't have, it's not like, I don't think, they own slaves. It's not like there's like I don't know, I have no idea, a massive kind of disagreement about how this house should be interpreted. There's a house in Troy, New York, where very similarly, the wife was, her husband died. She had 14 kids, and she raised them all herself. How she did that, we have no idea. And they never really mentioned it in the interpretation. I was consulting, and I said, well, you know, this seems very relevant to, you know, what is a kind of teenage pregnancy in Troy, all of this stuff. And they said, it's one of the worst in New York State. And I said, well, what about your Planned Parenthoods? We've got so many of them in Troy. I said, well, what about making a connection with your interpretation with those real life organizations and giving part of your building so they can meet and it can actually help so that they understand even this woman, even this house, which looks fancy right now, she probably had the same problems that you're experiencing today. How you get to that in terms of interpretation, I think, is really creative. It's just kind of opening your mind to thinking about how to make these ideas relevant to today. But that makes it a really kind of complex narrative. Like I said, I don't really know your history enough to know how you would engage that kind of, I don't know, simultaneity of narrative.
One of the things I've been thinking a lot about is something that Julian Smith here has been doing a lot of work on, and that has to do with creating mental maps of spaces. And so Julian has his own particular name for the practice, but the term that I use is deep maps. And so the deep map's an idea that was created by the Situationist International in France in the 1950s. And as I understand it, the basic concept is to marry the map with a story. And what you can do is layer multiple stories onto a particular given space, and each story is basically giving a mental representation of what that particular space meant to the people who were situated there. So, I think that would apply to your particular case study with Stuyvesant. I certainly see this being something that's very useful for, a place like Willowbank and so on. But it does give an opportunity to convey a multiplicity of voices about what a particular space represented or meant to the people who occupied it. The only problem is I don't know if we really know how to build one yet.
Right.
I was just thinking of, again, in archaeology, that's so often what we've got. We've got these different stories, and sadly enough, there's very few examples, I would say, where you get to see the layers, the rare opportunities. There's the viewing glasses, and actually one that struck me that I just loved, took a picture, but it turned out lousy because of the flash. But it was a shop, and I was in a small community in Italy, and you could see in through the shop that it was a modern ladies' dress shop, but they had, for whatever reason, sort of a 1 meter square unit that had gone down probably 5 or 6 meters beneath, and they had the pins in showing some of the levels, and there was the meter stick, but then there was plexiglass over, and it was just a shop. And I thought it was a wonderful sort of way of representing the different layers, but you could come in and buy ladies' wear and not give it a hoot, or you could come in and find that was what brought you there. So that ability to superimpose the different, how will you do that and still allow the different, so everybody comes in and can have a slightly different experience. I'm just thinking of a restored building, actually, when Elaine and I worked in the city of Mississauga, and it was doors open, and it was a dentist office now in a historic house. And when they did their interior work, they really got into embracing the historic past occupation, and so they had photos up on the wall of the different family members, and they had a blow up of the historic atlas map, and so people would come, and the dental practice was really getting into it. It gave them sort of an angle, and they left a room upstairs open for community meetings, but they also did stuff around new, like implant technology and stuff like that. So it's sort of, and then they were so excited that first year they opened up to do a Christmas party and take a sort of historic theme and tie that in, but it drew clients to come have just be going to see the dentist, and they didn't give a hoot about the historic part of it. So it was just an interesting experience for me to watch all the different kind of ways of being in this space and what they chose to take away, and people would come and look at the map and remember the history of the area. Or
You make a really good point.
Sorry, just to interject, they just did their 5th Christmas event.
Oh, that's so nice.
3 years since, so.
I showed that one picture of yoga in Madame Jamel's boudoir. It's just, and it's sold out every week, every Saturday.
We do it monthly at Spadina House.
See, it's just really interesting. It's just, part of the problem that I see with historic sites is they need you to love their history as much as they do. And that's just usually not the case. Like if you're going to this dress shop, you're interested in history, obviously, and archaeology, but you're going there to buy a dress or something like that. So you just have to open yourself up interpretively to as much possibility. Remember I talked about that all of these shifts are scary, but they also have so much promise in possibility in them. You just have to kind of, I keep saying, make a philosophic mind shift. If it means you give one of the rooms here to community space and you're constantly having people who don't care about this place coming in and out, they will. But that takes a kind of philosophic space to allow. If this became, every Saturday morning a community space and you allowed anything to happen in here, and whatever this town needs, if you can provide it, that's interpretive.
Sorry, I saw Clinton's hand up earlier, and then Elaine.
Well, I just thought it was very interesting, this discussion, much more interesting than I thought it would be.
Thank you. You can sit down now.
Oh, but he won't.
How to say that diplomatically? Because there's so many things that strike off. But in terms of the professor's approach to history to foster critical thinking and theoretically or to the ultimate end of benefiting humankind going forward, the role of an institution, and Franklin, you seem to be helping us keep our historic places alive by making them places of consumer entertainment, window washing, pillow fighting, no pants day on the subway. Those are really, are they parts of a continuum? So the only way I can integrate you, Penny, is thinking that if we can...
Hold on, we're going to hear what he has to say.
Yes, if we can have people put the arrowheads back on arrows and shoot apples off each other's head here in the room, we might bring all three of those elements together, past, present, and fun. Where are we on that continuum? Here at Willowbank or in the broader world?
Can I, and actually that ties into what I was going to say, I think, so I'm going to talk to Clint, you guys don't have what I was going to say is what I'm hearing from the panel, what I heard this morning, and I think speaks to what you raised, is that our focus is wrong. Let's not look at what's here, what's the sacred cow, what is, you know, what can we let slip. Let's focus on the fact we have a space, we have a community, and let's bring the community in. Let's come in and be the space, and then everyone who comes in here becomes the arbiter of their own interpretation. So they will come in like Penny's hole. When we have a museum like this, there's a hole in the ground, and you look down, well, it says you're going to your yoga class, you run by it. So it almost feels like let's not worry so much about what's sacred, but let's just get the people back in here, because our biggest challenge in this field is empty houses. If you have an empty house that will get burned down or, you know, demolition by neglect.
And remember that map I showed? We call it the empty donut.
Yeah.
Whatever your dimension is. In New York City, we said it was around 6 football fields. But we generally don't pay any attention to that empty donut. How many times have you heard, oh, I've never been in there, I didn't even know it was open to the public.
Exactly.
I hear that all the time. You know, and here's this group of dedicated people spending their whole lives trying to make this place cool and interesting, and most people just walk right past it.
Yes.
I just want to, you know, I'm interested in Clinton's question about sort of the spectrum and where we sit on it currently, and I'm also interested in the concept of, you know, making these sites fun, and this sense that we've really moved from an object-centered approach to our cultural resources to a visitor-centered or audience-centered approach. So whereas in the past, a lot of our policies were written around, and a lot of our kind of expectations about how cultural resources should be treated were based on the idea that we're preserving this object for perpetuity and for later generations so that they can use it even if we want to use it. So we all might want to touch an object, but if we all touch it today, who can touch it 2 centuries from now? And that's the idea that really kind of has perpetuated throughout the preservation field for a really long time. We've since moved to kind of this visitor-centered approach, which means that we prize what the visitor wants. And we've heard from a lot of the speakers that what the visitor wants today are these types of multi-sensory experiences, these kinds of hands-on, direct contact with history and those objects of history that become kind of our artifacts. So it's interesting, you know, you mentioned taking the arrowheads and putting them back on an arrow and letting people use them again. And it's kind of, my question would be then, you know, okay, so what are the dangers of this? I know it's probably not a popular question for, you know, when we're trying to be really avant-garde in our thinking or whatnot, but are we pushing too much to the visitor-centered kind of concerns? And what does that mean for future generations and their objects? And I think that does kind of touch on everybody's talk from this panel, because when we look at digital technologies, they are problem-solving tools for that kind of question, where we're looking at balancing conservation concerns or preservation concerns with visitor engagement. I think, you know, we have, and archaeology has been dealing with that for a long time too, where you take an object out of the ground that's been there for centuries, and you said, well, why can't we touch it now? It hasn't been behind a glass vitrine for the last, you know, however long, so.
Well, you know, the two examples that I showed, the window washing and the Poe plaster, I mean, I think probably 80-something% of Poe cottage is new material. And the window washing, the windows needed to get washed. You know, now, were conservators washing the windows with white gloves? No, but my people would have been fine wearing white gloves, and we used the correct solution. The reason why I just present it this way is, you know, I'm not saying turn them into Disneyland. What I am saying is the communication methodology for interpretation needs to be reconsidered. And for some reason, maybe it's because of my loud mouth, people tend to go like all or nothing. You're going to sit on George Washington's chair and you're going to break it, and then my great-grandkids are not going to be able to see that chair. Of course, that's not what I'm saying. But what I am saying is the way you convey the importance of that chair needs to change. So I'm not saying abuse what we have now, utilize it now and get rid of it. I'm saying reconsider the communication methodology, how we communicate this information. That's where I'm coming from.
Yeah, and then because I think of my academic background and how, and whether it be in terms of legislation and things that you're allowed to do or not allowed to do, because this place does have an easement and it has designation on it. If you do archaeological work, it needs to be done vis-a-vis someone with a license and what have you. So there are rules, but moving away from it being quite so restrictive and finding ways to involve people, because I think you can. The archaeology is sort of a quirky, interesting window into the way people live. So maybe you pull out all the broken bits, and the room gets, you have a plastering open house, and for a moment in time, maybe it's 5 years, it's interpreted one way, and you get everybody in, and we make it look like what the Hamiltons had it like, and it's funny. We're so fearful that that'll be done wrong. The archaeology will be done wrong, and ironically, as we're trained, we always look back at past archaeological work, or it seems like conservators and museum specialists look at past museum work. I worked at Fort York, and everybody was appalled at some of the restoration that was done in the 30s with public money. So even those that were experts got it wrong by our definition later in time, so who cares if it gets done wrong? And we leave the room for, let's say, 5 years as how the Hamilton had it looking. And people get to be involved in that, and there's an awareness perhaps that in 5 years from now, it's not going to look like that. And you can help plaster and turn it into, and maybe you keep parts where it's got the viewing panels, so those are the parts that everybody didn't have their hand in, and so we can see maybe as touchstones as time goes by what on earth really it did look like, and can come back to it. But I like the idea that it's just, as I've spent more years in archaeology, my sort of, what I would like to do as my superhero thing if I had time is just go out to so many First Nations and Indigenous communities with boxes of artifacts, because I know they're stashed away, and people who have them stashed away wish they weren't, but don't simply have the time. But just to open up this stuff and let everybody get their hands on it isn't a bad thing. It would be pretty wonderful. And it would stop me hopefully going to retirement parties of my future and saying, you mean there's archaeological materials in Ontario? And we have no one to blame but ourselves that people feel that everybody has to go to Europe to touch those things. There's enough archaeological materials and sites in Ontario, over 20,000. I'm sure some of those are a single find spot, that we could all touch them all here and go volunteer and get involved and never have to go to Europe and damage some of those UNESCO, you know, terribly fragile sites, and we could all have an experience. It makes me think of the empty house museum and the people who never knew it. They got it right for their moment in time, but nobody used it, and that seems very unfortunate. Or was aware of it. That even seems sad.
Somebody fainted back here.
Well, thanks for that question. That was a great sort of ending point. It's sort of person at the center is a great sort of homecoming for this field, because this field gained prominence during the Romantic period that was a reaction against the stark empirical nature of the Enlightenment. And this field became popular when people said, no, I get no feeling from this. This doesn't do anything for me. But ironically, the field is an Enlightenment field in so many ways. It's based on measurement and reconstruction. So we're finally back where we began in a lot of ways. So thanks for the discussion. And